So, the final lesson is on how to be a better community member, and it involves reducing your prejudice at the end. But let's talk a little bit more about what that means to be in community with each other, living together as a social organism, trying to live our best lives while not hurting others. So, one of the things that we struggled with in social psychology early on was why do people not help others? There was a famous case, Kitty Genovese, which was probably in your textbook, where this woman was murdered and 50 people watched her die and so forth. Now, they do suggest that those news reports were not true. There were multiple people who called the police and so forth, but it still led to an investigation of why do people not help? When do people help? So, in a situation, they had this complicated group interaction where each person either thought they were the only person that could hear what was going on. Like, so they were engaging in these, like, kind of telephone kind of calls, and they either thought it was like a party call and everybody could hear. They thought they were the only one who could hear the next person. So it was either they were having like a big group conversation or these one on one kind of conversations. So the one person represents they thought they were the only person who could hear what was going on. The two people represent they thought multiple people could hear what was going on. Then then they heard somebody fall. And they heard somebody fall and it sounded like they broke their leg. And then they measured how long it took them to help. And they found that when people were alone, they helped right away. But when people thought, or excuse me, when people thought they were the only person who could hear the fall, they helped right away. But when people thought multiple folks could hear it, they were much slower to provide help. And so this is actually really interesting because you'd think you'd want to get hurt in a city where multiple people you'd have greater chance to be helped, but that's not the case. You want to actually get hurt if you're the person that's falling. You want to fall when there's only one other person around. You're going to be more likely to get help that way. Now, why does this happen? Why do we not help when we're in a larger situation? We call it pluralistic ignorance, and let me show you a video of this of an actual study that shows pluralistic ignorance in action. You just saw my Jordan photos. Now this has no sound, and you can see this person sitting down, and it's a little blurry. Excuse me, I was a little thirsty. Smoke starts coming in, and the participant notices and is freaked out, rightfully so. Gets up, is like checking out, goes over to the door. It's like, what is going on here? Trying to figure this out. It's not. You can tell it's fake smoke. If it was real smoke and hot, you'd be running out of that room. But still, there's, who knows what that is? Is that a chemical warfare? Who knows? Go get help. Now, participant number two is with a whole bunch of what we call Confederates, and those are just people in the study that are acting like they're participants, but they're not. So everybody else there is just getting paid to sit there and act like everything's okay. And at this moment in time, when you compare the two participants, you see a very different response. You're noticing it. Look at her. She's looking at other people for their perception of what's going on, trying to get like a little bit of information. Just looks around, is laughing a little bit, like nobody else notices. Like keeps going back to it though. Keeps going back to it. Like what is going on here? What is going? Nobody else bothers with it. 5 minutes later, um, nobody else seems to care. Much slower response time to get up and to save oneself. Now let's put this in situation. Smoke's filling a room. Get out of the room. That's terrifying. That's dangerous. Go, 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 go. That's what you should do, right? But instead, what do you notice when you're with other people? You're looking to them for information. 20 minutes later, like there's like a struggle. There's like this weird smoke in the room. The experimenter finally comes and like gets the participant and ends it, but that person never left the room. Cancel. Escape. Close that down. Leave, sure. Alright. I have no idea what's going on here. Alright. Nope. There we go. Okay. So what you got going on there is like we don't help because we look to other people, and if they tell us it's not an emergency, we don't help. That's what we're seeing there. Um, another, what does lead to help though? What can we do to get people to help? Now we can use empathy. And before you interact with somebody, you just imagine how whatever you're going to do will impact them. So imagine how they will feel about their pain and how this pain has affected his or her life. Try to remain objective. This is an experiment. Like the upper condition, we call that perspective taking. But a perspective taking intervention like that creates empathy. So if you just imagine how your words are going to impact somebody, or imagine how your actions are going to impact somebody, you're going to be, or even imagine how a situation impacts somebody, a bad situation, you're going to be more likely to help them. Even if you just think about like something that's very egregious, like helping the homeless in the Father Woody's organization. It's like they provide a Christmas party for homeless folks every year. It's like, oh, imagine the pain of being homeless during Christmas. Imagine how that hurts that person that's homeless and so forth. All of a sudden you're like, wow, oh, that you supposed to be the happiest day of the year. It's supposed to be with family. You're on the streets. Maybe you're with your family on the streets. These kids, oh, the kids. Now you look at my face, right? These are, I'm not making these emotions up. It's like, oh wow, thinking about a kid that's on Christmas that doesn't have a present. Like that's a sad that's a sad situation, and I want to help, and I really do right now. I really want to help them out by just thinking about their situation. If I try to remain objective, maybe I start thinking about economic policies or capitalism or like economic theory, and all of a sudden I'm not really feeling the desire to help. In the first condition, I wanted to help. In the second condition, I didn't. So in the experiment, then they present this story about a student who broke both legs and one arm and can't go to class and needs help, right? If you're trying to remain objective, it's like, well, you shouldn't have ran. Or if you're trying to understand how the pain impacts their life, you're like, oh, wow, they're trying to graduate. They're trying to get on with their life. They can't move forward and so forth. We measure your emotional state. We find those that are experiencing empathy, or those that are, engaging in perspective taking or feeling empathic concern. It's hurting. It's hurting to think about, oh, how would I feel if both my legs were broken, one arm was broken, I couldn't go to class, I couldn't get things done, right? I'm trying to finish up my degree. I'm in pain, like, oh, I feel for this. I feel for that kid. Or if I'm just like remaining objective, I'm like, shouldn't have run, I'm cool and calm like LeBron James. LeBron James definitely cool and calm. I'm a basketball fan if you can't tell. And then they were asked, how likely would you be to take notes for this person? Now, taking notes for this person would be going to classes that you don't have for 6 hours a week, which is a lot of time for a student. It's like quite a bit extra of studying time and class attendance for one to take. And they found that people that were in the perspective taking condition were much more likely to say yes to this than people in the remain objective condition. So what am I pointing out here? Is being objective bad? No, but when you're dealing with people and you're trying to be objective, you're not going to help them out as much. Being objective isn't always the best best standard for interacting with humans. We have emotions, we have feelings, they have pain. We want to help, we want to maintain social connection. And so my advice to you is start working on your empathy. Like if somebody's in a bad situation, imagine how that situation impacts them. Before you speak, think about, oh, could my words hurt somebody? I think that would solve a lot of the problems we have in college classrooms in discussions if students were just like, oh, imagine how my words are going to impact the students in this class, right? It's basic empathy, and our society and even college at some degree is like be objective, but being objective has a downside, and that's less likely to help. More likely to probably blame somebody for making a mistake. Sure, objectively, this person shouldn't have ran in front of the cars, but their legs are broken and their arms broken. I should help them. That's a good human thing to do. So building community requires us sometimes to not be super objective, but to allow our emotions and our interpersonal emotions to touch base. Now, I use this intervention to reduce racial bias in pain treatment decisions in nurses. So like how much pain medication and so forth do they provide to people? And we're going to now pivot to talk a little bit more about prejudice, just a little bit. It's not going to get too heavy. If you want to talk more, if you want to get heavy, you can come talk to me in my office hours. But I want to present with you with some of the interesting findings about the causes and solutions to prejudice. So how do you reduce your own biases? That's a question you're probably interested in. I want to provide some definitions. Prejudice. It's the negative emotional component of what we consider like this whole idea of bias. So negative affect towards a social group is prejudice. Stereotyping, negative cognitions towards a social group, or even just sort of like even cognitions that might seem positive or can be negative, right? Like, oh, like athleticism is associated with this group. That seems positive, but it's really negative. So really, these cognitive associations with groups, maybe negative isn't the best word there, but it's still a cognitive association. It's not real. It's like this a thought about how group does things. Prejudice is a feeling towards a group. Discrimination is negative behaviors towards a group. So you got feelings, thoughts, behaviors towards a group. Prejudice, stereotyping, discrimination. Racism is complicated. Racism is technically a system of oppression based on skin privilege, societal structure, not a personal defect. When most academics say racism, they're talking about a structure. Now, racist is complicated because it has two definitions, and academics often use both, just not at the same time. So any person who participates and benefits from a system of racial skin privilege would be technically a racist, even if they don't intend to benefit, even if they didn't like choose the society. So oftentimes when people say the word racist, they're talking about a person who participates in a system of racial skin privilege. Or they mean a person who believes that their race is superior. So those are the two definitions that are used, and it's just important to ask for clarification when someone uses those words. But in my field, in general, you see us call it racial bias because, like, when we call it prejudice, we're talking about emotion. When we call it stereotyping, we're talking about cognitions. When we call it discrimination, we're talking about behavior. When we're talking about in general, we call it bias. Now, what causes racial prejudice, racial bias? Racial discrimination, maybe. Segregation does play a role in all of these. Segregation is clearly also a discriminatory act. But in 1957, a social psychologist by the name of Menard went out and looked at West Virginia coal miners. And what was interesting about their life was they spent a lot of their life underground in a desegregated environment. You can see even here in these pictures of these workers, you have white and black workers in Virginia working together on the coal mines. And what do you think happened underneath ground? Well, humans that interact with each other, familiarity, all those things, they become friendly. And that's what Menard observed. But these folks, when they left those coal mines, they went above ground. They walked home. They weren't rich people. They walked home and they lived a completely segregated life. You know, that 12 hours during the day when you're working sometimes in the mines, you're friends with people of all different races that you work with. But when you hit that upper level and society says, no, you're not allowed to be together, then you're not friendly with your friends that you work with. And I think that's important because it points out how social structures play a role in our biases, right? Underground, the social structure isn't visible. You're hidden. Nobody's seeing you. Nobody's watching you. It's not being maintained. You're expected to work together. You're doing a job. You're on a team. You're friends. Above ground, there's these horrible ideas about why people of different races should be separated and all this horrible ideas that then make it impossible for you to hang out with your friends. And that's the sad truth of it. The societal structure plays a large role in prejudice, but we often don't focus on that. But this shows a clear example where it wasn't the people, it was the society that was to blame. Now, what else do we know? We know that desegregation by itself doesn't work. We know desegregation plus equal status contact equals non-prejudice. One of the things that a lot of folks don't understand about college, you got to think about why would a church that aims to improve the lives of humanity, connect people, living more ethical lives, like why would churches get involved in education? Because education, and colleges in particular, can break down these barriers. College is not a perfect place, but it's a place where students can have a higher level of equal status contact than the outside world, like student to student relationships. Your students, you're at the same level. You're going to work together on projects, right? This is a major function of college in our societies, to break down these barriers that are due to segregation in our world. And let me actually show you how bad segregation is in our world. Now, these segregation maps I'm going to show you can find on the New York Times, and you can find them for your own hometowns. And I can email me if you want that link. But if you Google segregation maps New York Times, you'll find the article. But if you notice here, like when you see blocks of color, that means these are residential units where people live, and a block of color means that is predominantly one race or ethnicity. And so this is New York City. What you can see is that the white people live with the white people, the black people live with the black people, the Latinx people live with the black people, or the Latinx people live with the Latinx people, the Asian people live with the Asian people, and so forth, right? We see segregation. In Chicago, I'm from just down on the, you can't see it on the map, but just go around like another 20 minutes, and I live right down there, out of the view there. But you can see the same thing. White people living with white people, black people living with black people, Latinx people living with Latinx people, and Asian people living with Asian people. You're like, oh, Chicago, that's the Midwest. Let's look at a more liberal place, like the Bay Area. Bay Area, you see the same thing. Sausalito is one of the richest, like suburbs, I don't know what you want to call stuff, areas of the Bay Area. Like, it's hard for me to describe. I'm from the Midwest. We don't have structures like this in our cities, but we do but you're noticing here, oh, that wealthy neighborhood is basically all white. San Francisco, very much highly white. Almost no black people living in San Francisco. And you look over at the Oakland area, you can see like black people living in Oakland. You can see some gentrification as well going on, and you can see Asian folks living together in various places throughout the Bay Area and so forth. But even in these liberal enclaves, you see racial segregation in our residential environments. And given that a lot of the schools we attend and so forth are based on, the zip code where we live, right? These things do matter. A lot of our life is spent interacting with people in our neighborhood. So you have people not interacting with each other. We live in a segregated country. This is Denver, just so you can see similar stuff here as well. You can see that there is a lot of white people living with white people, a lot of Latinx people living with Latinx people. You can see black areas of town, areas where black people live with black people. Now, you can also see spots of our gentrification that's going on. You definitely see that. You see maybe more of a white, non-white split, but you still see the segregation in Denver. And, you can see it. It's not as pronounced as it was for New York. It's not as pronounced as it was for Chicago, but our community is segregated as well. So equal status contact is desegregation plus equal status contact, is what we need. You can't have unequal status contact and prejudice or discrimination. So another aspect, let me move my video for you. Another aspect that causes racial prejudice is a weird one, and I just wanted to share it with you because this is how complicated the human mind is. Fear of death. Fear of death can cause one to accept hate speech more, and that's what this study shows. So essentially, the fear of death manipulation is pretty interesting. It's called mortality salience. And participants are asked to briefly describe the emotions that the thought of your own death arouses in you. So write about that's not fun. Number 2, jot down as specifically as you can what you think will happen to you as you physically die and once you are physically dead. Oh my Lord, I do not want to write that essay, but I got to. They're giving me extra credit. I'm going to write that essay, but wow, that's going to make me think about death versus briefly describe the emotions and what happens when you go to the dentist, essentially. Those are the two conditions. Then you read an essay that's a white supremacist essay about white superiority and white pride. Well, let's look at the control group, the bottom group. When they were asked to write about dental pain, they hated that essay. That essay was horrible. It is horrible. It's racist. It is racist. It is. And it's in both ways, technically. So I know that's a difficult word. That's a difficult definition. But keep in mind, yes, they hated that article in the control group. But when they were made to fear their death, they did not like it, but they did not hate it as strongly. So let's put that in perspective. When you're thinking about your own death, you're more accepting of, and these were all white participants, you're more accepting of a racist message that presents your group in a positive light. Why would that be? Well, the reality of this, we call it terror management theory. The idea is that we're all going to die. And part of the idea is if you look at our lives and our societies and all this, there's a lot of question of what's the purpose, what's the meaning, does this have any purpose, right? We don't want to go through life thinking that at the end of it, like when we're thinking about our death, that our life had no purpose, no meaning. Well, we get a lot of meaning from our social groups, including our racial groups. So now I'm scared of my own death. And while I don't like this message, it's a little comforting to me to realize that, oh, one of my group identities, there's something to be quote unquote proud of, right? I'm still a racist comment, but how do you get pulled to that, right? What's that racist comment mean or what's that racist essay mean in a situation where you're thinking about, does my life have meaning? Does my life have purpose? Does my life as a white person have purpose? It's somewhat comforting to deal with the thought that my life has no meaning. It's still unacceptable, right? But it allows us to understand, oh, when I'm scared of my own death, I'm going to be more accepting of racial bias that is in favor of my racial group, because that suggests that my life has meaning and purpose. And I think you're seeing some of that play out in our own society now with the COVID pandemic, with the politics that are, we're voting on here real soon, right? You can see some relationships here with stuff that's going on in our own country and our own fear of death. And I think I think that was a very interesting insight. Definitely living in a pandemic, we are surrounded by mortality salience these days, right? And we're also surrounded by an incredible uptick in racism these days as well. Racial bias, I should say. Yeah. So I just think that's really important to notice. Now, a long time in a long time ago in a land far, far away, I did an experiment when I was my first year in grad school. And I wanted to understand what caused people to be non-prejudiced. I ran a few studies on this. They're published in Psych Science. If you Google my last name, you'll find it. There's not very many of me out there. But ultimately in this study, we had black students nominate white allies, or we had just white students that we took from the average participant pool. And we wanted to examine their ability to, or their susceptibility to conditioning negativity. That negativity bias, I wanted to make a measure that was measuring their tendency to focus on the negative. So this is kind of like a measure of that negativity bias. Now, how this measure works is I simply showed a Chinese pictograph or ideograph, and I paired that with an awful picture, in this case, vomit. So remember the Pavlovian paradigm, right? Bell, food, right? So the bell is just a symbol. The food creates an emotional reaction. The ideograph is just a symbol. The image here creates a negative emotional reaction. So bell, food, image, vomit. Image, vomit. Image, oh, it went too fast for me. But, image, vomit, like so forth. So I conditioned that response. And then I wanted to see, well, did that conditioning stick? And so participants were simply shown the pictures of the EDFs. There were more than just one. It was a well-designed study, but if I show you all the components of it, the message will get lost. But I simply asked, how much do you like this ED graph? I think it was a 1 to 10 scale. It's probably 1 to 7, whatever. We'll assume 1 to 10. And participants that were allies nominated by black students didn't transfer that negative emotion to that ideograph. The average participant showed the negativity bias, focused on the negative, transferred the negative emotion to that ideograph. So, ultimately what we found here was one of the things that was likely making people non-prejudiced was having a learning process that was not the negativity bias, right? So in many ways, going back to the previous lesson, getting rid of your negativity bias can help you get rid of your prejudice. But also, I'm going to recognize this. Most people don't want to get rid of their negativity bias, right? I think we do, but most people don't, because it's a survival mechanism, like I said earlier. If you don't focus on the negative aspects in your environment, you can get hurt, you can die, and so forth. So ultimately, let's take this out a step further. Where are people learning the negative association, right, between the negative association with people of color in American society. Well, when I did this study, the thoughts were in the media. There was lots of, this was around the time of Katrina, there were lots of, what we could only call racially biased or racist media reports that, were showing, white people as surviving and black people as looting during the Katrina hurricane disaster and stuff like that. And so, one of the thoughts is like, where are we getting exposed to these associations? We get exposed to our media. I've recently downloaded TikTok, and there's quite an uptick of racially biased media on things like TikTok and unmonitored media sources. So, like, the more of that you see or are exposed to in our society, which is pretty much prevalent in many different ways, now that negative information is learned by most people. So if we keep presenting people of color and negatively on the media, you're gonna keep having people developing prejudice. Now there's very few people that were nominated. There are very few non-prejudiced people according to my research. It does exist, but one of the things is that they have a funky cognitive style that you can't really train. You can't really train out the negativity bias. When I showed you, it was in kids as young as 3 months, right? So we got to think about how the negativity bias is being applied to people of color in our society. So this is one thing that I learned, and it has some implications for how you should approach the world. Be careful about what you consume. Be careful about like what you read. Notice when underrepresentation in the media is there. Notice when stereotypes are present, right? Because otherwise, most of us, those of us that aren't in this category, that have this special cognitive ability, most of us are going to learn that negativity and develop that implicit biases. Which leads me to implicit bias. What's implicit bias? It's the prejudice that exists inside you that you don't know or don't believe or don't acknowledge or don't have control over. Okay, so implicit bias you've heard. I'm going to assume we understand it in a psychological term. It is bias that we are unaware of. It is bias that we don't have control of. And that's basically, and it's automatically activated. So ultimately, it's this bias that we don't have control of. We don't actively develop, but it still impacts our behavior. So how do we get rid of that? Well, what I'm giving you a task that I've used in my own research and other people have used in their research as one of the most effective ways to reduce implicit bias. Now, literally, you're going to see, there's a deck of slides that are after here. And what you have to do is push slides to the left that are pictures of black people or good words. And you're going to push slides to the right that are not black people or good words. So white people or bad words. And this is just a training task that's trying to de-learn all those associations you learned through the media and so forth. So let me just show you how that will work. Okay, left, right, 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 left, 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 right, left, 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 right, left, left, right, right, left, 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 right, 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 left, left, right, left, 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 right, right, left. Sorry, losing breath. Let me get a breath in there. Okay, this was left, right, right, right. Whoo! Shuffle the deck and do that again. You can do it physically. You can do it verbally like I did there. Practicing that, you're breaking down your implicit biases. This is one of the most effective ways to reduce your implicit bias. And it kind of gives you an idea, what is implicit bias? It's not something you actively developed. It's something you absorbed as being a sponge in our society. So what's the connection with everything I showed you here? Well, everything I showed you here can make you happier, more productive, have more friends, and reduce your own racial prejudices. My challenge for you is, in this awful time that we're experiencing now, that feels like the world is ripping us apart limb from limb, is to improve yourself. Try to make yourself happier. Try to make yourself and others better at school. Try to make a relationship in your life happen or better. We don't have to be lonely. Try to make your community better, including reducing your prejudice. I have a 50-pointer homework that is completely focused on making your life better. So check that out. I'm going to leave you with the most baffling study ever conducted in social psychology, Daryl Bem's 2011 study, where they showed in one study that studying after the test improves test grades. Yes, that's right. Take the test and study afterwards, and your studying goes back in time to improve your grades. Um, Clearly this is a fun little test, and it's kind of interesting to see how it works. I don't believe it's real. I don't. It does. This study does not replicate very well, but some people have been able to replicate the basic findings, so that's pretty interesting. The original study found 10 findings like this, where things from the future traveled back in time. Some of it were pictures were going to show up on a computer screen. Some of it was studying. Some of it was priming. Like all this other stuff. The one thing I brought this up was to show you, one, social psychologists do have fun with our science, and things in science aren't off limits to us. We will explore questions that seem ridiculous, like can the future impact the past? And to actually do that is pretty cool. But you can study like stuff like that in social psychology. But I've really enjoyed hanging out with y'all in these couple of lessons. And now I simply would like you to use the information I've given you to make the world a better place. In terms of the test, Dr. McCall is making up the test. I personally am okay with you either way having some of this material on the test. I'm sure Dr. McCall is going to put some of it on the test, but also I don't want you to approach this like it's life or death. I want you to get the lessons. I want you to not focus on the grade. I want you to live a better life. Become the better you that is inside of you. And that's my challenge for you. Take the advice I'm giving you today. I am an expert in my field, and I'm not lying to you. I'm trying to give you data that'll make you better. And I think you can do that. I think you can improve who you are. And I don't mean that as an insult. I think I can improve who I am too. So I really love social psychology. If you are a social psychologist, you will know, because you love science and you want to improve the world. That's what makes a social psychologist.